גם פחות או יותר לדבר באנגלית, למרבית צערכם. אבל נסכם קצת בעברית. אני אגיד שהפרספקטיב שלי בא כאחד שעוסק לרוב בדיני חושן משפט, בדיוק ההפך ממה שעכשיו דובר על ענייני קטין. ואני גם חוקר את הנושא וגם משמש כדיין בבתי הדין הרבניים, שהוא משהו פה טוען...
צוהר.
ארץ חמדה, בערך, אז של המגזר המודרן אורתודוקס, ודבר קצת מהזווית הזאת. So, but really what I want to think about is the way American law, particularly American arbitration law, creates and impacts the jurisdiction of the Beit Din. And to talk about some changes in American law, and then the way halacha has sort of changed and the practice has changed. I'll disagree a little bit with, not on the law actually, with Purop Chaim's discussion. I think it's a little bit too idealistic and optimistic, but we'll come to that in a minute. So, if we start from one perspective, the authority of the Beit Din in the United States, and really in all Western democracies, ought to be very weak. Once upon a time, Jews lived in kehilot, where there was no separation of dat u'medina, both from internal the Jewish community, and the state or the governing entity itself often aided the Jewish community's jurisdiction in understanding that Jewish problems belong in Jewish courts. In a certain way, the Israeli legal system continues that, right? Jews have to get married and certainly divorced through the rabbinic courts, Muslims through the Islamic courts, etc. Now, America and most Western democracies in its wake are founded on a principle of separation of church and state and religious freedom that fundamentally says that no person can be said to belong to a specific religious sect or a specific Beit Din. The state cannot force you to go and cannot enforce any punishments for not going. If we stop here, we would say the Siruv is dead. Yet, one of the most interesting aspects of American law in the last generation or two is two bodies of law that have come together to make the Siruv very much alive. And that is, and it was alluded to in both presentations, on the one hand, arbitration law, borerut, and on the other hand, religious freedom law. Chofesh hadat. Now, here's where I argue with my esteemed colleague. Over the last two generations, American arbitration law has become much, much stronger and much, much more permissive in terms of what can be arbitrated. I think this has very little to do with religion. Very little. Borerut. Very little to do with religion. Very little to do with multiculturalism, and everything to do with money. American business has been on a 25-year crusade to increase what can be arbitrated and therefore opt out of most regulatory structures in the business, commercial, and financial realm. One of the chief architects of this was a lawyer named John Roberts, now Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. You can guess how he's ruled. What has happened is a vast expansion of arbitration, which started between intra-commercial big businesses suing each other in the shipping and rail industries in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and now covers basically everything. The Supreme Court decides about 1.5 arbitration cases per term. Over the last 50 years, about 65 arbitration cases. That's more than any other federal statute. So everything is arbitrable. Hakol והוא רב. ולא שפיט. The second, see, I know a little bit of Israel. We've now ended. The second thing that's happened is that what counts as an agreement to arbitrate has lowered. Unlike in Israel, where you have the Chok Chozeh Achid, which, according to my understanding, prevents inclusion of an arbitration agreement in it, that is not the case in America. If you signed up for iTunes, for your credit card, for your bank statement, for your cell phone plan, you've agreed to arbitration in America. Third, what the arbitration does is it says it will freeze any case in court and compel you to go to arbitration. And finally, it's almost impossible to have substantive review, in other words, a court think, does this make any sense, of the arbitration decision. In other words, you can basically contract around, through arbitration law, most of American law. There are exceptions, that's for the course in arbitration. The result is that with an arbitration agreement, the state will use its powers and institutional structures to enforce a Beth Din's decision, a Beit Din's decision, and its jurisdiction, without really any review of what it says. Now, if we then add this together, a Beit Din in America that can sit in two different logics. It can sit as a Beit Din k'mo mikadma dinan, as an expression of the inherent authority of the kahal. That's one logic. The logic of maybe the pre-political, pre-existing religious institution. It can also, if you sign an arbitration agreement to go to a Beit Din or a particular Beit Din, it can sit as an arbitration panel constituted under American law, in which case the religion doesn't matter at all. Or you can combine them and do both, and then it could be very powerful, as maybe even more powerful than it was in the era of the Kahal. In other words, arbitration law allows the Beit Din to subcontract its enforcement powers of the Hazmanah, and ultimately the Siruv, to the American state, which will then enforce it. So, to illustrate, I know of a case where a kosher restaurant, in its employment agreement with all the workers, Jews and non-Jews, put an arbitration agreement to a certain Beit Din. When the non-Jewish worker sued for wage and hour violation, the American court sent him to Beit Din. It's not about religion, it's about arbitration. The American law is kind of blind to the religious aspects of it. I think this would not happen in Israel. I don't know, you guys will tell me, you'll tell me if it happened in Australia. I know that this happens in America all the time. As long as arbitration agreement is signed, they don't care. They don't see religion, they see contract. As American law has become more laissez-faire and less interested in policing arbitration agreements, this route has become more powerful, especially since you can put in arbitration clauses into general contracts, unlike we have here in Israel. So I want to consider the following case from New York, which Prop Chaim alluded to, which you see the power of these two logics together. A husband and wife had a marital dispute. The wife wanted to take the case to the civil court. The husband wanted to go to Beit Din. Under halacha, a case like this would say the parties must go to Beit Din, and the wife was threatened with a siruv if she goes to court. This siruv, as we said, can lend itself to social shaming and various social consequences. She therefore signs the agreement. Later she comes to court and raises an American contract law claim of duress. השוואה לא הוגנת, saying, look, I was religiously forced to sign this thing. It should be void under American law because I was coerced to do it. So the New York case says as follows. This is 1997, but there are cases both before and after that say this. And I want to read the words here for a minute. We find that the wife freely submitted herself to the jurisdiction of the Beis Din, and that this was a manifestation of her voluntarily undertaken obedience to religious law. You don't have to be, this is America, you don't have to be religious. You want to be part of a community? Play by its rules. As Chaim said, she wasn't subjected to any particular coercion greater than that which is intrinsic in the case of any member of a religious community who, at a matter of conscience, feels obligated to obey the laws of her religious organization. You make choices in life. In some, the release signed by the wife was, as a matter of law and fact, voluntary. I want to typify for a minute. What does the wife come? She says, look, halakha is a legal system. Halakha says I have to sign this document. If I don't sign this document, I will be in violation of halakha and subject to its sanctions. Under halakha, I have to sign this. It's not free will. What does the court give her? Protestant theology. Right? Those words I bolded. Voluntarily undertaken. Matter of conscience. Anyone who knows anything about Protestantism, and I know only anything, knows that these are big flashing lights of this is how Protestantism conceives of religion. It's an individual choice of conscience. And they say, look, you make lots of choices. This is America. Religious associations are voluntary. So long as you voluntarily affiliate with this Jewish thing, that's your business. You don't like it? Leave. As a matter of contract law, this isn't religious compulsion, and there's no barrier to enforceability. Now, there's a fascinating irony here. To enforce the outcomes of the halachic system under American law, the American legal system must deny the halakha as law. Instead, American law assumes we, American law, are the only real legal system here with coercive power. You, Jewish law, that's a matter of voluntary choice. To enforce halakha, you must deny. Okay, so that is how arbitration law impacts the Beit Din's jurisdiction as a formal matter. Now, I want to pick up a little bit on the way Yael talked and look to the more socio-cultural aspect. Because beyond the question of how Beit Din impacts the legal, how arbitration law impacts the legal status of Beit Din, there's a cultural dimension as well. When the state retreats from its own law and says you can contract around it through arbitration law, it winds up enhancing the Beit Din even when there's no arbitration agreement. In an era when to enforce the Beit Din, the only way to do it was through the community's own authority, it was limited to those parts of the Jewish community that were most closely interested in Jewish institutions and most skeptical of American institutions. This was a fairly small group, and particularly one that is least likely to engage in large-scale business transactions. By contrast, Orthodox Jews, that's what we're talking about basically, who were loyal to American law and most likely to be engaged in business and finance, were skeptical of the claims that we can have a state within a state the way we did in Europe. It was un-American to go to a Beit Din, especially for a case that wasn't Jewish in its inherent sense. It would violate the norms and customs of America to segment yourselves out. But now that American law says, not only can you go to Beit Din, we will enforce the Beit Din, we will help you with it. This allows Orthodox Jews to embrace Beit Din not only as a vindication of their loyalty to Jewish law, but as affirming the principles of freedom of contract and religious freedom they learned from American law. Appearing before a Beit Din can now be an act of dual citizenship, simultaneously quintessentially Jewish and distinctly American. Rather than see the halakha's desire to create a zone of autonomy within the state as competing with the state's claims, what arbitration law does is allow the Beit Din to build out its claims of autonomy from the state itself. When supported by American law, therefore the Beit Din can draw on a much wider swath of the community to support it, even when it doesn't have an arbitration. So I want to now turn to the last point and see how this plays out in practice. So if there's an arbitration agreement, you're going to Beit Din. American law is going to force you. If not, then it's very much dependent on the nature of the parties, the nature of the disputes, where they sit in the socio-political context of their communities. As a general matter, I would say that in choshen mishpat cases, in civil law cases, by the time we have to issue a shtar seruv, meaning after the three hazmanot are ignored, it can be difficult for a Beit Din to meaningfully enforce it. Parties who are well-connected can drag things out, as we heard. They can find rabbanim that say, no, you're right, no, you're right. And as soon as it becomes complicated, you lose the glue to allow the social shaming things to work. I think it is different in Gittin, as Yael said, but in choshen mishpat cases, the Beit Din I've seen does not tend to put a whole lot of muscle behind it. I know the Beth Din of America, they basically issue it and they send it to the rabbi of the community where the guy lives and said, your problem. You can imagine how much effort is taken in there. Usually my sense is there's some noise for a couple weeks and then not much happens. Of course, if the members of the same community and the Beit Din is associated with the community proceeding inside a chassidut, it would work differently. But I think asking only how the social sanctions enforce the seruv is the wrong question. Because the structure of American arbitration law does its work not in enforcing the seruv, but in shifting the status of the Beit Din and the types of cases that might plausibly come before it. A generation or two ago, your standard Beit Din case was typically for a small dollar amount and was either an institution, Mossad, and one of its employees, a Rebbe or a Moa, or Hilchot Shchenim, neighbors fighting over trees and windows and yards, right? Or something that had to do with a distinctly halachic matter, was the wedding kosher, or something very connected to Jewish and particularly Orthodox life. But what I've seen is that as we have gone forward, we now see a new class of case in Beit Din, and these are commercial cases, sometimes for 10, 15, 20, $50 million, that are not religious other than that the parties are religious. Now, once you have this kind of case, you immediately have lawyers involved, in addition to Toanim Rabbanim, maybe. You inevitably need more process, and you're inevitably more intermeshed with American law and American legal concepts. It becomes a somewhat different type of case, and here arbitration law is important because the lawyer is going to say, we're not going there unless we know we can enforce this in the civil courts. Now, let me give you just one recent example that I think pulls some of this together. So, imagine the following case. You have A, who is Dati, and A sues B, C, D, E, and F for engaging in a conspiracy against him. As I've mocked it up, imagine that two of these people are Dati and the rest of them are not. They are sued in secular court and civil court. B and D, in this hypo, come to Beit Din, and they say, hey, wait a minute. This case belongs in Beit Din. A is Dati, we're Dati, they belong in Beit Din. There's no arbitration agreement here. Now, A resists the hazmana And he says, I have two reasons why I'm not coming. He says, first, all these parties are involved in a common conspiracy. Kunia. And therefore, we have to hear the whole thing together. We have to hear the whole thing together, and since some of these parties are not coming to Beis Din, the whole thing has to go to civil court. The other thing he says is that these real estate things are owned in complicated corporate structures. So just, right, there's a person who owns it on top, but that person owns shares in an entity, and the entity owns the real asset, and there may be another entity. This could be, I've seen these about 8 or 9 layers down. This is really complicated in terms of who is authorized to sign on behalf of where the actual money is in 8 or 9 layers of corporate entities to come to Beis Din. And therefore he says, this has to go to secular court. Now, the case is too big and complex to review it entirely, but I want to end with a couple observations. First of all, note that in a case like this, religion in the narrow sense of the term is not relevant, right? This isn't a case that the only reason this would be in Beis Din is because the parties are dati. 2 generations ago, before arbitration law and Beis Din became so entwined, this case would have 100% gone to court. The Beis Din would have not even issued a hazmana in this case because it knows that this doesn't show up in Beis Din, and the party, A in this case, would have never even thought he has to respond. But because arbitration law has strengthened the structure of the Beis Din and changed the types of cases that come there, in this case, A at least feels he needs to respond. Then what happens is we'll now have preliminary hearings in Beis Din to decide whether this case has to be in Beis Din or not. So we now have this much more complex structure where we have what in America we call motion practice, say, is this case in Beis Din or is this case in court? And you have a whole little mini case just about that. As far as I know, this is very new. This hasn't happened. Now, last point, the substantive issues here are essentially American law issues, right? Who has to go together is what in American law we call necessary parties. This is not a halachic question. This is a American law question. In addition, which actual real person can bind the various entities is also essentially an American law question. Therefore, the Beis Din has to engage in effectively an American law analysis, understand what the American law rule is, and use that as an input into its decision as to whether this case belongs in Beis Din or whether this case goes to court. So we've now created these new hybrid structures precisely because arbitration law tends to mix these things together. So I'm pretty certain that this sort of inquiry is very new. There's more to say here, but it shows you how arbitration law changes the reach and function of the Beis Din, not only when there's an agreement like we talked about, but even like in this case where there is no agreement, when Beis Din's sole power is communal. Therefore, even in its absence, arbitration law increases the effectiveness of the threat of the Beis Din.